Missing person cases can be difficult to crack. However, most people go missing one at a time. In the 10 cases in today's video, multiple people disappeared at the same time. While there are some clues about how these people went missing, none of these cases have ever been fully unraveled. Number 10. The village at Lake Anjikuni. This one comes in at the bottom of the list today because there is some doubt about whether there ever was a village at Lake Anjikuni in Canada's northern Nunavut region. As the story, which was first published in the Danville Bee in 1930 goes, fur trapper Joe LaBelle returned to a remote Inuit village of about 25 people that he had previously visited, only to discover that everyone was missing. The tents and villagers' belongings were still there, but there was no sign of the inhabitants. According to this news account, LaBelle reported, "The whole thing looked as if it had been left that way by people who expected to come back, but they hadn't come back." He also noticed signs that ancestral graves had been disturbed. While there were dog skeletons in the village, he could find no sign of human corpses. However, there are some reasons to doubt this story, which entered the popular imagination when it appeared in Frank Edwards' 1959 book Stranger Than Science. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated the case in 1931, they determined there is no evidence to support such a story, noting that a village of that size wouldn't have feasibly existed in such a remote location, and that local officers, trappers, and missionaries had reported nothing out of the ordinary. Number 9. The Sodder Children. When George and Jenny Sodder went to bed on Christmas Eve 1945, 9 of their 10 children were at home. The 10th was serving in the military. By the following morning, the Sodder house was burned to the ground. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children made it out. However, 5 other children who ranged in age from 5 to 14 were never seen again. Initially, everyone, including the surviving members of the Sodder family, assumed the children must have perished in the fire despite their father's desperate attempts to rescue them. Because it was Christmas Day, the fire marshal postponed a thorough investigation of the site, which was basically a basement full of ashes at this point. A few days later, George Sodder bulldozed several feet of dirt over the remains of his home, planting flowers there in memory of the lost children. As time went on, more debris emerged that cast doubt on whether the 5 missing Sodder children had actually died in the fire. The family remembered some odd events around that time, meaningless in isolation, but suspicious in concert. Jenny had been awakened earlier in the night by a noise that sounded like something hitting the roof, and the family had received what they thought was an odd prank phone call just after midnight on the night of the fire. Additionally, a ladder had been moved from its storage area near the house to more than 75 feet away, hindering George's attempts to reach his children's upstairs bedrooms to rescue them. In another strange twist, the bones of the missing children, they were never recovered, despite the fact that the fire did not appear to have burned long enough or hot enough to destroy human bone. The Sodders never stopped looking for their missing children, offering a reward for information, erecting a billboard near their house, and hiring private detectives to follow up on reports of sightings, including a photo of a young man bearing a striking resemblance to one of the missing children, which was mailed to the Sodders. Some suggested that the children could have been kidnapped in retaliation for negative remarks George Sodder, an Italian immigrant, had made about Mussolini, or that the mafia could have been involved somehow. Despite the many theories that emerged, no conclusive evidence of what ultimately happened to the 5 Sodder children has ever been found. Number 8. The Yemenite Children Affair. Following Israel's founding in 1948, the state struggled to quickly absorb a rush of new immigrants. More than 50,000 Yemenite and other Jewish immigrants from the Middle East and Africa moved to the new state in its early years and were often settled in chaotic transit camps, temporary tent cities where new immigrants were housed due to a housing shortage. In these camps, babies and toddlers were often taken from their parents to be cared for in hospitals or nurseries, which ostensibly offered better living conditions. Unfortunately, some of these babies, estimates range from 650 to more than 4,000, were never returned to their parents. Some parents were told that their babies had died, though most were not shown a body or a grave, and many grieving parents weren't given death certificates. Recent DNA evidence has shown that some of the supposedly deceased Yemenite babies never died at all, but rather were placed for adoption with childless Ashkenazi Jews of European descent families. In 2016, one Israeli cabinet official who was part of a panel investigating the disappearances gave credence to the activists' claims that the children were systematically stolen and placed for adoption when he admitted that hundreds of children were taken from their families, saying, "They took the children and gave them away. I don't know where." Number 7. Flight 19. Flight 19 didn't consist of a single plane, but rather a group of 5 planes, US Navy TPM Avenger bombers, which took off from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station for a training mission between the Bahamas and Florida on the afternoon of December 5, 1945. The planes and the 14 experienced airmen on them they never returned to shore. The pilots of the group of planes, which have become known as the Lost Patrol, could be heard conversing with one another and sounded disorientated by the fact that at least some of the pilots believed their compasses were malfunctioning, and also the worsening weather, which made assessing their position difficult. The lead pilots made the decision to fly east, believing that they were in the Gulf of Mexico, a course the planes apparently stuck to until one pilot's last transmission. All planes close up tight, we're left to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops to 10 gallons, we all go down together. 2 flying boats were dispatched to look for the missing patrol. One of those boats disappeared from radar and never returned. 13 men were lost. A passing merchant spotted a fireball in the sky and saw evidence of an oil slick in the water, suggesting it likely fell victim to an explosion. Despite an extensive search by the Navy, bodies and debris from the missing patrol and the missing rescue mission were never located. A team of Navy investigators ultimately attributed the loss of Flight 19 to causes or reasons unknown. Number 6. The Mary Celeste. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste, a 282-ton brigantine, set sail from New York City, bound for Genoa in Italy. It carried cargo of 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, 7 crewmen, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, and his 2-year-old daughter. When the ship was next spotted, almost a month later, 400 miles east of the Azores, the ship's cargo and provisions were largely intact, though the lifeboat was missing. But there was no one on board. The Mary Celeste was in reasonably good shape, other than some water in the bottom of the ship, and the crew of the ship that discovered it, the Dei Gratia, were able to sail it on to Gibraltar. So, what happened to the 10 people on board? Well, there's no definitive answer to that question. Some suspected foul play, laying the blame on the crew of the Dei Gratia, who had applied to receive the salvage value of the ship. However, after a salvage inquiry was conducted, there was no evidence that this had occurred. Other theories, including mutiny, an explosion caused by the Mary Celeste's boozy cargo, or an irrational decision by the captain, also appeared unlikely. Anne McGregor, who created a documentary film dedicated to unraveling the mystery, believes the evidence suggests that a faulty chronometer, along with a failing water pump aboard the ship, prompted Captain Briggs to believe the ship was in danger of sinking and to give the order to abandon it. The crew must have thought they could get to the Azores. Since the lifeboat never arrived, though, nor was it ever recovered, the definitive fate of the 10 souls on board the Mary Celeste remains a mystery. Number 5. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. In late January 1959, a group of 9 students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute and a ski instructor set off for a skiing expedition to Mount Otterton in the northern Urals. Only one of them, Yuri Yudin, who had to turn back early due to health problems, ever returned from the trip. When the 9 others didn't make contact as planned, a search party set out to locate them and uncovered a grisly mystery. The first thing the rescuers located was the students' tents, which had been sliced open from the inside. Most of the group's belongings were still in the tent, which appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry. Investigators found footprints showing that the group had fled the tent barefoot, in socks, or wearing a single shoe. The bodies of 2 of the students, dressed only in their underclothes, were found near the remains of a campfire. 3 more bodies were found between the fire and the tent. All 5 were determined to have died from hypothermia. A couple of months later, the 4 remaining bodies were found at the bottom of a ravine and showed signs of crush injuries, and the tongue of one had been ripped out. Tests on their bodies showed trace amounts of radiation. The Soviet military looked into the incident, somewhat vaguely determining that the group had died from a natural force they were unable to overcome, and classifying the materials related to the investigation. In early 2019, Russian prosecutors announced that they were re-examining the case, though they were only considering theories associated with natural phenomena. Said spokesman for Russia's prosecutor general, "Crime is out of the question. There is not a single proof, even an indirect one, to favor this criminal version. It was either an avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane." Number 4. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. On March 8, 2014, a Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777 carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members took off from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, bound for Beijing. It never arrived. A months-long international search yielded only a few pieces of the plane, found thousands of miles from where the flight veered off course. However, the bulk of the plane's fuselage, along with the presumed remains of those on board, has yet to be located. The disappearance and the lack of clarity about why or how the plane went missing shocked the world. As Miguel Marin, chief of operational safety at the International Civil Aviation Organization's Air Navigation Bureau, put it, "It was inconceivable that in this day and age we would lose an airplane that big without a trace." There are a few clues about the plane's disappearance. The plane turned sharply off its planned flight path, a maneuver experts suggest would have been carried out manually versus autopilot, and the aircraft's responder stopped transmitting, possibly due to a malfunction, but more likely because it was turned off. While the pilot's home simulator did show some flight path similar to that undertaken by the flight shortly before it disappeared from radar, an investigation of the captain's private life failed to turn up any signs of any sort of disturbance that would provide a motive for suicide and the deaths of more than 200 innocent people on board the plane. Further, the Malaysian government dismissed this theory and suggested a mass hypoxia event rendered all on board unconscious while the plane flew on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed. More definitive evidence about what happened on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 may yet turn up, as the plane's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder have, as of mid-2019, not been located. Number 3. The Flannan Lighthouse Keepers. On December 26, 1900, a small ship made its way to a remote Scottish island. It carried a replacement lighthouse keeper who was due to rotate in. However, when the ship arrived, no one emerged to greet it, even after the horn was sounded and a flare was fired. When the replacement lighthouse keeper rowed ashore and climbed to the lighthouse, he quickly discovered something was wrong. In the lighthouse, there were supposed to be 3 lighthouse keepers. When the replacement arrived, he found that everything was in place. However, the lighthouse keepers were nowhere to be found. The official explanation suggests that the men were swept out to sea by a large wave as they attempted to secure some gear on a cliff during a storm. While it was protocol for the 3 never to be outside at the same time, it's theorized that the 3rd lighthouse keeper would have gone out to warn his friends about an approaching wave, and then they were all swept away together. Number 2. The Students of Iguala. One night in September of 2014, a group of about 100 university students from a rural teachers' college in Mexico headed out to the city of Iguala to commandeer several buses to carry their group to a march in Mexico City a few days later. According to reports, stealing buses was something of a local tradition, and neither the bus companies nor the authorities were particularly alarmed when this happened. After an altercation at a local bus depot, the students headed out on 5 buses, trailed by police, some of whom started firing on the buses. 43 students on 2 of the buses were eventually taken into police custody. They were never seen again. Only one of the students' bodies have been identified. The official account, disputed by international investigators and friends and families of the missing students, is that the students were kidnapped by local police officers who turned them over to a drug gang, which then killed them and burned their bodies. International investigators were brought in 2015, but when they failed to support the government's version of events, the hostility and stonewalling they encountered led them to abandon the inquiry, though a federal court ordered another investigation that's been conducted in 2018. As of mid-2019, there was no conclusive evidence on the fate of the missing students. Number 1. The Lost Colony. In 1587, a group of 115 English settlers founded the Roanoke Colony on an island off the coast of North Carolina. Later that year, John White, the colony's governor, sailed back to England to secure additional supplies for the fledgling settlement. However, just as White arrived in England, a naval war broke out between England and Spain, and every ship was ordered to participate in the war effort. By the time White made it back to Roanoke, it was 3 years later, and there was no sign of the settlers. The only clues were the word Croatoan carved into a fence post and the letters CRO carved into a tree. Croatoan was the name used for what is now called Hatteras Island, as well as the name of the Native American tribe that populated the area. Reportedly, White had agreed with the colonists prior to heading back to England that if the group needed to leave Roanoke under duress, they would carve a Maltese cross symbol into a tree, but no such sign was found at the site. Despite several contemporaneous and modern investigations, the fate of the colonists remains a mystery. The most likely theory is that the colonists moved locations, perhaps splitting into multiple groups, possibly assimilating with local Native American tribes. Other theories suggest that the colonists were killed by Native Americans, killed by Spanish settlers, or tried to sail back to England and were lost at sea. While research is still ongoing, and some hope that DNA analysis will at last unlock the mysteries of the colonists' fate, the lost colony has managed to remain lost to the world for more than 400 years. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe and ring that bell so when we put out new videos, which is every day, by the way, you will find out about those. Also, I've got another channel, it's called Biographics. I'm going to link to that today. We do biographies of notable people from history. Please do check that out and consider subscribing if you want to. And as always, thank you for watching.